Another perfect autumn day. It's interesting living in this country. Although we've got the oldest living culture on the planet with a 65,000 year history, and we have one of the youngest sovereign nation states in the world, which achieved independence on the 1st of January 1901, and colonisation began in 1788, we seem to have a peculiar ideas regarding the past. And living in Australia is a little bit like waking up in the morning, a brand new day, and the past is forgotten. It's as if history begins when we wake up in the morning. And to a significant degree, this is due to the fact that as a people, whether we are First Nations, whether we've been here for 6 or 7 generations, whether we arrived as migrants or asylum seekers or refugees, whether we're first generation or second generation, the fact is that there are many unpalatable myths surrounding our history. So the best way to overcome that is to deny the past. It's no wonder First Nations people, both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, demand truth-telling as part and parcel of their strategies to move towards reconciliation. Without truth-telling, they say there is no pathway for reconciliation. But the fact is, it's not just about First Nations history. It's about the history of ordinary people. People who work hard, pay their taxes, obey the law, which is not etched into the history books. The stories about the trade union movement and the fact that we had one of the first Labor governments in the world which gave preference to trade unionists in terms of employment in 1911 has had a profound impact on the type of life we lead today, because we have not lived this type of life because those who own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication were happy for us to share. And there are many phases of our past. And why is it important? Well, the fact is, if you don't know your past, you don't understand the present, and you have no plans for the future. So in many ways, it's like living a life Groundhog Day. You repeat the same mistakes over and over again. And if we look at this country's history, since colonisation began, it's the same issues over and over again. And I think it's important we look at a truism. And that truism is that the known cannot be unknown. I'll repeat it again, it's very simple. It's not an original idea. But the known cannot be unknown. But the unknown can be written, rewritten, manipulated, changed to suit those who exercise power today. And although you may want to push aside the known because it is uncomfortable, or ignore it, or criminalise or marginalise the people who bring it up. The fact is that we need to acknowledge the known. Otherwise, other people write our history. Other people determine our present. Other people determine our future. So what I'd like to do today is just look at a few issues that are not known, that are important in terms of understanding who we are and how to move forward in a country of increasing inequality which grows by the day, in a country where two breadwinners have to work in any unit, family unit, in order to pay the rent or pay the mortgage, in a country where the social elevator has been destroyed on an ideology based on reversing the gains of the past, whether it's through deregulation, corporatisation, globalisation or privatisation, issues which we have spoken about ad nauseum on this YouTube channel. So I'm sure most people who watch these YouTube channels are familiar with this country's First Nations past. But unfortunately, a significant number of Australians, as we saw at the recent Anzac Day ceremony, can't even stand the thought of a welcome to country by a group of people who have no real power. Even that offends them. And we've got the ridiculous situation in the state of Victoria, which is the first state which has been able to work out a treaty between First Nations people in Victoria and the state government, that the opposition, the Liberal National Party opposition, will be and the divided nation will be going to the next state election at the end of November with a policy of tearing up the treaty because they believe that they can use that hatred, those myths, to promote their ideological agendas. Now, it's extraordinary. I'm the convener of the Tanami Morbohina Commemoration Committee. It took us 10 years to force the Melbourne City Council to erect a monument to Tanami Morbohina, two Tasmanian Aboriginals, who were the first people hung in Victoria on the 20th of January 1842 for having the audacity to resist white colonisation. And 10 years later, there are no other significant monuments across this country to the frontier wars, which resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of men, women and children defending their country. On Anzac Day, we honour the fallen, those who in the majority of cases fought other people's wars. But we can't even acknowledge the destruction of the frontier wars and the continuing legacy, negative legacy of colonisation, which we see around us every day. But I don't want to dwell on things you're aware of. I want to dwell on things you may not be aware of. I want to talk about the significance of the trade union movement in this country, not today's trade union movement, which only incorporates 12% of Australian workers, mainly in the public service at the state and federal level. A trade union movement which has been beaten down by successive legislation, where we have the ridiculous situation in this country where it is illegal to take strike action outside an enterprise bargaining agreement period. And if you do, not only can that union be shut down, but more importantly, individual workers can be fined and have been fined up to $10,000 a day for taking part in an unregulated strike. Let's not forget this was the first country in the world which elected a Labor government. And one of the first pieces of legislation that was passed by that Labor government was the fact that they gave preference to employment to trade unionists. Trade unionists would have preference to employment. And it took World War I and the War Precautions Act to remove that preference. And then we saw in the 1920s the nationalist government led by Stanley Bruce, who lost his seat in the election in 1928, who attempted to create a low-wage economy based on exports, wanted to have a similar economic situation to what we saw in many Asian countries and colonies, where wages were low, profits for property owners was high, based on an export model. Let's not forget that after World War II, when the country was under threat of invasion by the Japanese imperial forces, that over 25,000 Australian soldiers died during that war. But unlike the World War I, which was fought by workers at either end of a bayonet for the glory of God, King and country, this war was fought against fascism, against authoritarianism, against Nazism, against some of the most horrific situations that we've seen since the beginning of human time. Extraordinary situation. And when they came back, they found themselves being ignored by the government of the day. And they demanded change. And through a referendum, the Chifley-led Labor government was forced to hold a referendum, as I said before, to ensure that the Commonwealth government was responsible for the introduction of pensions. So there's a proud trade union history. Today, trade unionists are considered little more than criminals. If you say you're a member of a trade union, people look at you. People have forgotten that everything that they are able to access today, whether it's reasonable wages, holiday pay, sick pay, domestic violence leave, and the list goes on, is due to trade union activity, is due to trade unionists, people coming together to demand a bigger share of the pie. Where is the history? Where is the knowledge that the only way forward, if you're a wage earner, is to be in a position where you can join fellow workers to bargain, not as an individual against some transnational, multinational corporation, but as a group against that same organisation. Let's look at the history of immigration in this country. Let's not forget that unless you're a First Nations person, you're an immigrant. You're a descendant of immigrants. We have the story, which is told over and over again, of how the country was tamed. But we don't have the story about how thousands, if not tens of thousands of small farmers were forced off their land. Not just by drought or flood, but by government decisions. Where is the story about demutualisation? When people came together to form mutual aid societies, like the Australian Mutual Provident Fund, which was demutualised in the mid-1980s to help people survive in a private investment for private profit land. Where are those stories? Where are the story of the immigrants that came after Federation, that came between the world wars? The Italians, the anarchists, the socialists, the communists, the non-politically aligned, who tried to alert their fellow Australians regarding the horrors which were developing in Europe, the authoritarianism, the fascism, the Nazism. Where are those stories? We don't hear those stories.